Long before the Saxons appeared in written history, their world was shaped by tides, marshes, and shifting coastlines. The North Sea littoral, encompassing modern northern Germany, southern Denmark, and the Netherlands, formed a distinctive environmental zone that would shape the communities later recognized as Saxons. Archaeological investigations reveal that between approximately 1000 BCE and 100 CE, this region consisted of a complex mosaic of tidal marshes, estuaries, and riverine systems, notably the Elbe and Weser. These waterways provided not only access to marine resources but also natural transport routes that facilitated localized trade and communication. The fluctuating coastline and the regular inundation of low-lying areas necessitated adaptive subsistence strategies, combining mixed agriculture with seasonal fishing and exploitation of salt marshes. Pollen analysis and sediment cores indicate a pattern of cereal cultivation alongside pastoral husbandry, demonstrating a reliance on both arable and livestock-based production. Settlements in the North Sea zone were dispersed rather than urban. Excavations at sites such as Feddersen Weird and the marshlands of Friesland reveal low-density farmsteads, often constructed on artificial mounds or terps to mitigate flooding risks. Domestic structures were predominantly timber-based, with wattle daub walls and thatched roofing, reflecting the availability of local resources and the absence of centralized architectural programs. Archaeologists have documented a continuity of settlement patterns across centuries, indicating stable occupation despite environmental pressures. This decentralized settlement pattern points to a social organization organized at the kin group level rather than under centralized authority. The environmental conditions of the region also shaped mobility. Seasonal flooding and shifting waterways limited the potential for permanent roads or large-scale infrastructure, while simultaneously encouraging a flexible, semi-nomadic approach to resource exploitation. Archaeological evidence, including the distribution of ceramic styles and tool assemblages, demonstrates that groups maintained seasonal movement between upland pastures and low-lying marshes. These adaptive strategies reflect an intimate knowledge of local geography and its limitations, supporting subsistence while minimizing risk from tidal events. Comparative studies with neighboring Germanic populations to the south and east indicate a set of shared cultural practices rather than rigid ethnic divisions. Burial customs, including flat inhumation and cremation, as well as the material culture of domestic pottery and iron tools, display notable similarities across northern Germany and southern Denmark. Such patterns suggest sustained contact and exchange networks between communities rather than a single, cohesive Saxon polity. Linguistic evidence from later West Germanic dialects traces roots in these areas, but the identity termed Saxon had not yet crystallized as a distinct socio-political entity during this period. The river systems, particularly the Elbe, acted as conduits for interaction. Archaeologists have uncovered early trade goods, including bronze ornaments and imported ceramics, in settlements along these rivers, indicating that the North Sea communities were not isolated but participated in broader networks stretching across the North European plain. The movement of these goods suggests a complex pattern of exchange, reliant on small craft and overland transport during low tide, rather than on large-scale maritime infrastructure. Settlement patterns and material culture together illustrate a society adapted to a dynamic environment, capable of exploiting its resources while remaining relatively autonomous. Environmental adaptation extended to construction techniques. The repeated use of terps or artificial mounds indicates a long-term investment in site preparation, suggesting community knowledge of hydrological patterns and soil stability. Domestic and ritual spaces were deliberately sited to maximize protection from flooding while maintaining access to fertile fields and aquatic resources. Excavations of hearths, storage pits, and granaries demonstrate practical strategies for food security and storage, further highlighting the pragmatic organization of these early Saxon communities. The lack of urban centers reinforces the understanding of early Saxon society as decentralized. Unlike contemporary Mediterranean polities or the Roman provinces, settlements did not develop large-scale fortifications or monumental public structures. Defensive concerns were addressed primarily at the local level, often through natural geographic features, such as raised ground or water barriers, rather than through coordinated regional military structures. Such patterns are consistent with kin-based political organization, where authority was exercised locally and leadership was situational and negotiated within smaller communities. Marine and fluvial resources provided additional economic stability. Archaeologists have documented fishing implements, shell middens, and salt extraction facilities, indicating the integration of tidal and estuarine zones into subsistence economies. These resources, combined with cultivated crops and pastoralism, allowed communities to maintain resilience in the face of environmental variability. Evidence from faunal remains suggests that both domesticated and wild species contributed to diets, while isotopic analyses of human remains confirm a mixed consumption of terrestrial and aquatic protein sources. Interactions across the North Sea region were also facilitated by craft specialization. Iron production, woodwork, and textile manufacturing appear at various sites, suggesting the emergence of small-scale workshops. Tool typologies indicate shared technological knowledge and gradual refinement over time. Such specialization implies organized labor and skill transmission within communities, further defining the material culture that would later be associated with the Saxons. By approximately 100 CE, the cumulative effects of geography, subsistence strategies, and material culture had established the North Sea communities as a coherent cultural region. They were neither unified politically nor ethnically, but they shared adaptive strategies and social structures that distinguished them from surrounding populations. The archaeological record demonstrates continuity and gradual development rather than abrupt emergence, setting the stage for subsequent social consolidation and identity formation. As geography shaped survival, material culture began to define identity, laying the foundations for the Saxons' eventual recognition in historical sources and their later migrations across northern Europe. Before we continue exploring the development of Saxon identity and early culture, consider subscribing to the channel and clicking the bell icon to receive daily Nightfall history videos. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know which part of the segment you found most intriguing. Ethnic names often appear in texts before they exist as realities. Between approximately 500 BCE and 200 CE, the North Sea region witnessed significant developments in material culture that would later be associated with Proto-Saxon populations. Archaeological excavations reveal the presence of iron-working communities, whose settlements were characterized by small farmsteads and seasonal dwellings adapted to marshy terrain. House forms typically consisted of timber frame structures with wattle and daub walls and thatched roofs, constructed over sunken or leveled floors to provide stability and insulation. Excavations at sites such as Feddersen Weird and Siedlungsgeland in Schleswig-Holstein illustrate continuity in these domestic patterns, demonstrating a persistent approach to construction that accommodated both environmental constraints and social organization. The layout of these farmsteads indicates a kin-based community structure, where extended families managed plots collectively while maintaining relative autonomy from neighboring groups. Burial customs during this period provide further insight into evolving ritual practices. Early cremation cemeteries, prevalent during the Late Iron Age, display urns with standardized forms and occasional grave goods, including iron tools and personal ornaments. Later inhumation burials, appearing closer to the turn of the Common Era, reveal increasingly differentiated treatment by age and status. Archaeologists have noted variations in grave orientation, inclusion of weapons, and associated ceramics, suggesting the emergence of socially recognized roles within communities. These funerary practices indicate a gradual standardization of ritual behaviors, reflecting both local tradition and broader cultural influences from neighboring Germanic groups. The material culture of this period also highlights technological and martial development. Iron tools and weapons, including swords, spears, and knives, have been recovered in both settlement and burial contexts. The distribution and typology of these implements indicate small-scale production within communities, rather than centralized manufacture. Archaeological evidence from weapon assemblages suggests that while conflict occurred, it was primarily localized, serving to defend territories or assert status among kin groups. The presence of imported bronze and other materials, albeit limited, points to engagement in wider trade networks, particularly along river routes such as the Elbe and Weser. These interactions fostered the diffusion of technology and influenced local material culture. Written sources provide an additional, though external, perspective on Saxon identity. Tacitus Germania, c. 98 CE, mentions peoples labeled as Saxons, among other northern tribes, emphasizing their customs and behaviors from a Roman viewpoint. Such accounts must be approached critically. They document observation rather than self-identification, reflecting Roman ethnographic conventions rather than local perceptions. Tacitus notes the maritime mobility of these groups, their weaponry and social hierarchies, but the text provides no evidence of unified political or ethnic consciousness. Combined with the archaeological record, these references suggest that what would later be called Saxon was initially a fluid designation applied externally, encompassing diverse communities sharing similar subsistence strategies and cultural practices. Linguistic evidence complements the material and textual data. Reconstructions of early West Germanic dialects indicate that the speech forms later associated with the Saxons developed gradually across the North Sea plain. Place names, personal names, and later runic inscriptions suggest continuity with these early dialects, supporting the conclusion that language served as a vector of cultural cohesion even in the absence of centralized authority. These linguistic patterns also demonstrate links with neighboring Germanic populations, implying ongoing interaction and shared communicative frameworks. Ceramic production and decorative styles further reflect early cultural continuity and regional variation. Pottery from this period includes both plain utilitarian wares and ornamented vessels, often featuring geometric motifs. Analysis of clay composition and manufacturing techniques demonstrates local production, while stylistic affinities with adjacent regions indicate exchange of ideas and goods. Similarly, metalwork, including brooches and fibulae, exhibits standardized forms that allow archaeologists to trace networks of contact, influence, and mobility across Northern Europe. The combination of localized production and selective adoption of foreign styles illustrates a dynamic balance between autonomy and interaction. Spatial analysis of settlement patterns provides insight into social organization and community relations. Farmsteads and cemeteries are frequently positioned to exploit natural features, such as elevated ground and riverbanks, while maintaining proximity to arable fields and pastures. The distribution of dwellings suggests a non-hierarchical organization, where leadership may have been situational and dependent on kinship or personal achievement. Archaeologists have documented clusters of farmsteads connected by shared burial grounds or resource areas, reinforcing the notion of loosely linked communities rather than centralized polities. By the end of this period, Proto-Saxon communities had established a recognizable regional identity grounded in shared material culture, environmental adaptation, and linguistic continuity. They were not yet unified under a single political authority, nor did they possess a collective self-identification as Saxons. Instead, identity emerged gradually, shaped by the intersection of local environmental adaptation, social organization, and external observation. The archaeological and textual record together demonstrates a coherent pattern of cultural traits that would later form the foundation for what Roman sources would label as Saxon. External contact with Roman territories, coupled with emerging maritime and overland trade networks, would soon accelerate cultural consolidation, setting the stage for Saxon involvement in migration and settlement beyond their North Sea homelands. Rome shaped the north not by conquest, but by proximity. Between approximately 50 BCE and 250 CE, the northern European landscape was defined less by imperial dominion than by strategic observation and interaction. The Roman Empire, at the height of its territorial expansion, extended to the Rhine River, establishing a frontier that separated controlled provinces from the unconquered territories of northern Germanic peoples. Archaeological and textual evidence shows that regions beyond the Rhine, including the territories later associated with the Saxons, remained outside direct Roman administration. Yet the influence of Roman presence was significant. Excavations along the Rhine and adjacent areas reveal the distribution of Roman coins, imported glassware, and metalwork, which appear in settlement and burial contexts across northern Germany, and the southern Netherlands. These materials attest to trade and exchange networks rather than military occupation, illustrating how Roman goods permeated peripheral regions. Roman military strategy along the Rhine relied on fortifications, patrols, and client relationships rather than full-scale conquest of northern territories. Frontier installations such as the Limes Germanicus provided not only defense but also points of economic contact. Archaeologists have uncovered hoards of Roman coinage in northern settlements, indicating that northern communities engaged in both formal and informal economic exchange with Roman garrisons. These interactions were mutually beneficial. Local populations acquired material goods, while Romans leveraged alliances with tribes to secure intelligence, obtain recruits, and stabilize the frontier. The presence of Roman weaponry, including swords and shields, in northern contexts may reflect either trade, tribute, or the movement of mercenary groups into Roman service. The flow of Roman goods also influenced social and political dynamics among northern communities. Access to imported items often conferred status within local groups, incentivizing competition and alliances. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that settlements near riverine routes, particularly along the Elbe and Weser, were more likely to contain Roman imports, suggesting the selective penetration of trade networks. These material exchanges fostered connectivity across a wider geographic area and contributed to the gradual consolidation of social structures. Political authority in this period remained localized, but the availability of Roman goods and the prestige associated with them encouraged the emergence of influential leaders capable of negotiating both internal and external relationships. Textual sources complement the archaeological record. Roman historians, including Tacitus in his Germania, describe northern Germanic groups as diverse and politically decentralized. Tacitus notes the autonomy of tribes along the Rhine and emphasizes their military mobility, communal decision-making, and engagement in raiding across Roman frontiers. While these accounts reflect Roman observation and often stereotyping, they provide a valuable perspective on the perceived dynamics of Northern Europe. Together with material evidence, they suggest that the Saxons were participants in a frontier economy, interacting with Roman authorities and neighboring peoples without forming a unified political state. Military and diplomatic pressures from Rome had indirect consequences for northern societies. The proximity of Roman garrisons and the imposition of tribute obligations incentivized raiding as both a means of wealth acquisition and a demonstration of power. Archaeological traces of fortified farmsteads and weapon deposits suggest that northern groups prepared for episodic conflict while maintaining mobility. These pressures also facilitated mercenary activity, as northern warriors were recruited into Roman military campaigns, further integrating them into imperial economic and social networks. Such participation provided northern communities with both material resources and knowledge of Roman military organization. Economic interactions were not limited to war or prestige goods. Evidence from riverine and coastal settlements indicates that Roman amphorae, glass vessels, and metal tools were used in domestic contexts, reflecting adaptation rather than imitation. The selective adoption of Roman goods illustrates how northern communities incorporated external technologies and commodities while retaining local practices in agriculture, settlement planning, and craft production. This pattern of selective integration underscores the agency of northern groups, who engaged with Rome on their own terms, shaping the contours of regional identity through material culture. The presence of Roman influence also had implications for social differentiation. Elite households, identified through larger dwellings and the possession of imported goods, exercised authority over kin groups and controlled access to resources. Archaeological findings indicate that such households often coordinated seasonal labor, resource allocation, and ritual activities, reflecting the interaction between material wealth and social hierarchy. The circulation of Roman items contributed to the formation of emerging leadership structures, demonstrating how external contact could reinforce internal organization without imposing direct governance. By the mid-3rd century CE, the cumulative effects of trade, military interaction, and cultural exchange had established a distinctive pattern of northern engagement with Rome. Communities in the Saxon heartlands were economically and socially integrated into the frontier system, yet they retained autonomy and decentralized governance. Settlement continuity, burial practices, and material culture reflect local adaptation rather than Romanization, confirming that influence was indirect and mediated through proximity rather than conquest. The archaeological record demonstrates a nuanced balance between contact and independence, setting the stage for the Saxons' eventual emergence as a recognizable cultural group in the historical record. As Roman authority weakened during the 3rd century, northern communities gained increased autonomy and visibility, creating conditions that would later facilitate Saxon expansion, migration, and more pronounced engagement with the territories of Britain and continental Europe. The Saxons first appear not as settlers, but as raiders. During the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, Roman textual sources began to record the presence of peoples identified as Saxons along the North Sea and English Channel coasts. Ptolemy's geography and later Roman military reports reference groups operating outside imperial authority, emphasizing their maritime mobility and propensity for coastal raids. The term Saxon in these sources refers less to a unified political entity than to a collection of maritime communities distinguished by their seafaring activity. Roman observers described these groups as a persistent threat to trade and frontier settlements, noting both the frequency and the strategic organization of their raids. These accounts provide the first chronological anchor for Saxons in the historical record, situating them as actors on the periphery of Roman economic and military systems. Archaeological evidence corroborates textual accounts of Saxon raiding activity. Coastal sites in northern Germany, the Netherlands, and along the Frisian Islands have yielded weapons such as iron swords, spears, and shields, often found in concentrations interpreted as defensive deposits or abandoned raiding equipment. Excavations of shipbuilding remnants, including clinker-built hull fragments, indicate the technological capability for extended maritime operations. The presence of these artifacts demonstrates that seafaring was integral to Saxon communities, enabling rapid strikes along coastal settlements and river mouths. Settlement continuity inland suggests that raiding was an extension of local economic strategies rather than a displacement of populations. Roman sources also describe the social and military organization of Saxon raiders. Military manuals and reports highlight the use of small, mobile war bands capable of coordinated attacks on vulnerable coastal targets. These groups often exploited the tidal flats and estuarine networks of the North Sea, using shallow draft vessels to navigate areas inaccessible to larger Roman ships. Tacitus and later commentators, while observing from a Roman perspective, note the combination of martial skill and knowledge of local geography, underscoring the practical intelligence of Saxon raiding strategies. This emphasizes that Saxon activity was adaptive and opportunistic, rather than chaotic or disorganized. The economic dimension of raiding was significant. Coastal communities beyond the empire were often targeted for plunder, including livestock, grain, and portable goods. Archaeological distribution patterns indicate the movement of Roman coins and imported objects northward, consistent with the extraction of material wealth during raiding events. These exchanges contributed to wealth accumulation within Saxon communities and facilitated the emergence of local elites who could organize, lead, and distribute resources. In this context, raiding functioned not only as military action but also as an economic strategy integrated into broader subsistence and trade systems. Contemporary Roman military responses further illuminate the Saxons' role. Fortifications along the Frisian coast and river mouths, including watchtowers and temporary encampments, were established to monitor and respond to raiding activity. Written records document punitive expeditions and diplomatic arrangements with northern communities, indicating that Rome recognized both the threat and the political complexity of the Saxons. Rather than attempting permanent occupation, Roman authorities employed a combination of defense, negotiation, and occasional retaliation, acknowledging the logistical challenges of controlling maritime raiders operating beyond provincial boundaries. Linguistic and onomastic evidence complements the textual and material record. Place names and personal names recorded in Roman sources reflect West Germanic origins, consistent with archaeological findings of settlement continuity. The term Saxon itself appears initially as an external label applied by Roman observers, encompassing groups that may have identified differently internally. This demonstrates that early ethnic terminology often emerged from outside observation, defining communities in relation to imperial perceptions and geopolitical interaction rather than self-definition. The coastal and riverine environment played a central role in enabling raiding activity. Shallow estuaries, tidal flats, and interconnected waterways provided natural highways for small craft, while inland marshes offered concealment and strategic positioning. Archaeological surveys reveal the strategic placement of temporary encampments and landing sites, indicating careful planning and environmental awareness. Material culture recovered from these sites, including weapon caches and domestic items, suggests that raiding parties were semi-permanent features of local society, operating in cycles that balanced maritime predation with ongoing subsistence and settlement. By the end of the 4th century CE, Saxon raiding activity had become a defining feature of Roman northern frontier interactions. The combination of maritime skill, localized knowledge, and opportunistic strategies allowed these communities to exert influence far beyond their immediate settlements. Archaeological and textual evidence together illustrate a complex relationship with the empire, one in which the Saxons acted as both economic participants and military challengers, shaping Roman frontier policies without being subsumed into imperial structures. The pattern of raiding established during the late Roman period would gradually evolve into migration, as Saxon communities expanded their presence into Britain and other neighboring regions, marking the next phase in their emergence as a distinct historical and cultural entity. The end of Roman Britain created space for new societies. Between approximately 400 and 500 CE, the political and administrative structures established by Rome in Britain began to disintegrate. The withdrawal of Roman military authority, driven by pressing imperial challenges on the continent and chronic resource limitations, left a vacuum across the province. Archaeological evidence documents both continuity and transformation during this transitional period. Excavations reveal sunken featured buildings, commonly referred to as Grubenhäuser, scattered across southeastern and eastern England. These small timber structures, often sunken into the ground to provide insulation, indicate permanent occupation rather than temporary encampments. Their distribution corresponds with areas later associated with Saxon settlements, suggesting that migrant communities established enduring domestic and agricultural footholds. Cemeteries from this period further illustrate the nature of Saxon presence in Britain. Both inhumation and cremation practices are evident, sometimes accompanied by grave goods such as weapons, brooches, and personal ornaments. The placement of these burial sites near domestic settlements demonstrates continuity of social and ritual practices and confirms the presence of cohesive communities rather than episodic raiding parties. Archaeological analysis of weapon burials, including iron swords and spears, indicates that martial capability was maintained alongside agricultural and craft activities, reflecting the dual role of settlers as both cultivators and local defenders. The scale and character of Saxon migration remain subjects of scholarly debate. Earlier historical interpretations posited large-scale invasions that displaced existing Romano-British populations. However, recent genetic studies and material analyses suggest a more gradual demographic transformation. Population replacement appears limited in scope, with incoming Saxon communities integrating with residual Romano-British inhabitants in many areas. Evidence from isotopic analyses of human remains indicates varied origins, while the persistence of Romano-British pottery forms alongside Germanic material culture reflects cultural exchange and adaptation rather than wholesale displacement. Textual sources provide complementary evidence. Gildas' 6th century De Excidio et Conquest Britanniae describes the arrival of Saxon groups, emphasizing conflict and settlement in the post-Roman landscape. While the work is polemical and must be approached critically, it offers insight into the perception of these groups as both newcomers and active participants in local political reorganization. Roman military records, though largely silent on the precise timing of withdrawal, corroborate a period of diminished imperial oversight, creating conditions for incoming groups to occupy strategic agricultural and coastal regions. Settlement patterns suggest careful selection of sites with access to arable land, fresh water, and navigable rivers. Many Saxon farmsteads were located near former Roman roads, villas, or urban sites, taking advantage of existing infrastructure and strategic locations. Archaeologists have noted reuse of Roman building materials, including tiles and masonry, demonstrating both practical adaptation and continuity with earlier construction practices. The integration of Romanized landscapes into new settlement structures facilitated agricultural productivity and reinforced the permanence of Saxon occupation. Economic and subsistence practices during this period were diverse. Excavated remains indicate mixed agriculture, with evidence of cereal cultivation, animal husbandry, and localized craft production. Tools such as iron plows, sickles, and whetstones reveal the application of both continental and locally derived technologies. These economic activities enabled Saxon communities to maintain stability and support gradual population growth, further reinforcing permanent settlement rather than transient raiding. Material culture demonstrates both continuity with continental traditions and adaptation to the ecological and social conditions of Britain. Weaponry and fortification provide additional insight into the organization of early Saxon settlements. Evidence of small-scale defensive structures, including ditches and palisades, suggests that security concerns were addressed at the community level. Unlike the Roman military system, these fortifications were temporary and localized, reflecting decentralized governance. Archaeologists have documented concentrations of weapons in both domestic and burial contexts, indicating the importance of martial capability within settlement networks and the potential for small-scale conflicts between groups or with residual Romano-British populations. Interactions with remaining Romano-British communities were complex and regionally varied. Archaeological evidence demonstrates instances of cultural integration, including the adoption of certain ceramic forms, continuity of agricultural practices, and adaptation of metalworking techniques. These interactions suggest that the Saxons did not universally impose their own culture, but engaged in selective assimilation and negotiation, gradually establishing social and cultural frameworks that would support their long-term presence. By the mid-5th century, the cumulative effects of settlement, material culture, and localized economic and military organization had established Saxon communities as enduring features of the British landscape. These settlements functioned as cohesive units, capable of sustaining agriculture, craft production, and defense, while maintaining links to continental homelands. Archaeological and textual evidence together indicate that Saxon presence was characterized by permanence, integration, and strategic adaptation rather than episodic intrusion. The establishment of permanent Saxon settlements required the development of new political structures to coordinate resource allocation, social organization, and leadership, setting the stage for the emergence of early Saxon kingdoms in Britain. Migration divided Saxon history into two trajectories. While a portion of Saxon groups crossed the North Sea into Britain, many communities remained in their ancestral homelands in northern Germany and the southern regions of Denmark. Between approximately 400 and 600 CE, these continental Saxons maintained their traditional settlement patterns, consisting of dispersed farmsteads and small clusters of dwellings, reflecting a decentralized social structure. Archaeological surveys in regions such as Holstein, Lower Saxony, and Friesland reveal continuity in domestic architecture, agricultural practices, and craft production. Sunken featured houses and timber-framed constructions persisted, demonstrating environmental adaptation and localized construction techniques inherited from earlier Iron Age traditions. These settlements remained largely non-urban, lacking centralized fortifications or administrative centers, and underscoring the tribal and decentralized nature of continental Saxon society. Political organization among continental Saxons was similarly localized. Leadership was primarily exercised at the level of kin groups or small confederations, often through councils of elders or war leaders. This decentralized governance is evident in the absence of inscriptions, administrative records, or monumental architecture typically associated with centralized authority. Archaeologists have noted that the distribution of defensive ditches and palisades is irregular and concentrated around individual settlements, suggesting community-level responses to external threats rather than coordinated regional defense. The fragmentary nature of political structures facilitated both internal flexibility and vulnerability to external pressures, particularly from neighboring powers such as the expanding Frankish kingdom. Interaction with the Franks during the late 5th and 6th centuries illustrates the limits of Saxon political cohesion. Gregory of Tours and other early medieval chroniclers document episodic conflict and negotiation, highlighting resistance to Frankish expansion while acknowledging periods of tribute or temporary submission. Raiding and counter-raiding were frequent along border areas, and archaeological evidence of weapon deposits in northern Germanic contexts suggests preparation for recurring military engagement. These encounters were rarely aimed at permanent conquest or administration, but instead reflected the tactical and opportunistic strategies employed by decentralized Saxon groups to maintain autonomy within a shifting geopolitical landscape. Religious practice among continental Saxons further underscores continuity and independence. Pagan beliefs, centered on deities such as Woden, Thunor, and Tiw, persisted despite increasing contact with Christianized neighbors. Archaeological sites contain ritual deposits, sacrificial sites, and cultic objects indicating sustained ceremonial activity. Sacred groves and water features were focal points for religious observance, while burial customs continued to integrate cremation and inhumation practices, often accompanied by weaponry or personal adornments. The maintenance of pagan traditions provided both social cohesion within communities and a distinct cultural identity in contrast to Frankish Christianization efforts. Material culture reflects both stability and selective adaptation. Tool types, pottery styles, and domestic implements display continuity from earlier Iron Age and Roman-influenced forms, while imported objects from neighboring regions, including Roman and Frankish artifacts, indicate ongoing exchange networks. Metalworking, particularly iron production for agricultural and martial purposes, demonstrates technological continuity alongside adaptation to new environmental and economic circumstances. The circulation of prestige goods, combined with localized production, reinforced hierarchical differentiation within tribal groups while sustaining broader cultural continuity. Settlement patterns along rivers and coastal plains reveal strategic adaptation to both environmental and political conditions. Sites along the Weser, Elbe, and EMS rivers exhibit clusters of dwellings and cemeteries, often positioned to exploit fertile floodplains while retaining defensible positions. Archaeologists have documented associated agricultural infrastructure, including field systems, storage pits, and drainage features, indicating sustained investment in the landscape. These practices highlight the interplay between environmental knowledge and community organization, enabling continental Saxons to maintain economic stability despite decentralized governance and external pressures. The continuation of raiding and mobility within continental Saxon society demonstrates the persistence of martial traditions established during the late Roman frontier period. Weapon assemblages, including spears, shields, and swords, are found in settlement contexts, suggesting both preparedness for conflict and symbolic assertion of status. Maritime capability, though more limited than in coastal Britain, facilitated movement along riverine and coastal routes, allowing continental Saxons to engage in trade, tribute, and occasional raids. Such activity reinforced social hierarchies and intergroup alliances while maintaining cultural autonomy. By the end of the 6th century, continental Saxons had established a resilient, though politically fragmented, society. While some communities participated in raiding or alliance networks, the overall structure remained decentralized, non-urban, and organized around kinship and local leadership. Archaeological continuity in housing, material culture, and ritual practice demonstrates cultural stability, despite the challenges of Frankish expansion and broader continental pressures. The Saxons' retention of traditional social and religious structures highlights the persistence of tribal organization as a defining characteristic of continental Saxon identity. These diverging trajectories, migration to Britain and continued continental settlement, would produce distinct cultural and political outcomes, setting the stage for the emergence of early Saxon kingdoms in Britain and sustained tribal resistance in northern Germany. Power among the Saxons was negotiated, not imposed. Early Saxon political organization was fundamentally decentralized, relying on kinship structures, local assemblies, and situational leadership rather than permanent centralized authority. Communities were organized around extended family groups or clans, known in later sources as Gowan, which managed local landholdings, resource allocation, and dispute resolution. Archaeological evidence, including the distribution of settlement clusters and grave goods, suggests that authority within these groups was exercised through personal prestige and demonstrated competence rather than formalized office. Leaders often emerged through military skill, negotiation ability, or wealth, and their influence extended primarily over their kin and immediate allies rather than across broader territories. Assemblies played a central role in governance and the administration of justice. Known in later legal sources as things or moots, these gatherings brought together free men of the community to deliberate on disputes, adjudicate crimes, and make collective decisions regarding defense or resource management. Evidence from comparative Germanic practices indicates that such councils operated through consensus, with decisions enforced socially rather than through codified court. The gatherings reinforced social cohesion, allowing communities to regulate behavior, resolve internal tensions, and maintain order without reliance on hierarchical state structures. The exercise of authority was therefore situational and negotiable. Leadership during wartime could differ from that in peacetime, and individuals could gain prominence through acts of bravery, successful negotiation with neighboring groups, or the accumulation of material wealth. Archaeological distribution of weapons, prestige items, and burial richness supports this model, demonstrating the concentration of status and influence within certain households or kin groups. The absence of monumental architecture or administrative centers further emphasizes the personal and localized nature of Saxon power structures. Legal frameworks among the Saxons were initially customary rather than written. The later Lex Saxonum, compiled under Frankish oversight in the early medieval period, preserves the memory of these early practices. While the text postdates the period under discussion, comparative analysis indicates continuity with pre-Christian customs. Laws regulated compensation for injury or death, inheritance and property disputes, and they reflected social hierarchies and kin-based obligations. The prominence of collective responsibility, such as wergild, monetary compensation for crimes, illustrates the reliance on negotiated social enforcement and community accountability rather than centralized judicial authority. Military leadership was integrated into this system of negotiated power. War leaders, often emerging from kinship hierarchies, directed raiding expeditions, organized defensive measures, and coordinated intergroup alliances. Archaeological evidence from weapon caches and settlement fortifications demonstrates both preparedness for conflict and the capacity for flexible response to external threats. Leaders commanded authority during mobilization periods, but their power was contingent upon consensus and ongoing recognition by their peers, highlighting the fluidity and situational nature of early Saxon governance. Relations between local groups were managed through both diplomacy and alliance networks. Interkin agreements, arranged marriages, and joint military ventures reinforced social and political bonds. Evidence of shared burial customs, stylistic similarities in weaponry, and coordinated settlement patterns supports the conclusion that alliances were maintained through negotiated social and cultural practices rather than through formalized state institutions. These interactions facilitated both conflict resolution and cooperation, enabling decentralized Saxon communities to persist in the face of external pressures from neighboring peoples and emerging polities. Economic and land management systems were similarly localized. Control over arable fields, pastures, and resource areas was vested in kin groups and exercised through negotiation. Allocation of resources, access to pastures, and use of shared waterways were subject to customary agreements enforced at local assemblies. Archaeological evidence, including field systems, storage pits, and settlement distribution, indicates that these practices were functional and adaptive, supporting both subsistence and emerging social hierarchies. Authority in economic matters rested in the hands of respected individuals or households rather than centralized institutions, reinforcing the decentralized character of early Saxon society. Religious and ritual practices intersected with governance, reinforcing social norms and legitimizing authority. Sacrificial sites, sacred groves, and ritual deposits provided communal focal points for decision-making and dispute resolution. The integration of religious observance with legal and political functions created a cohesive framework in which moral, social, and practical obligations were intertwined. Leaders who demonstrated piety, facilitated ritual obligations, or acted in accordance with communal customs strengthened their authority, illustrating the interdependence of belief systems and governance structures. By the early medieval period, the cumulative effects of decentralized authority, kin-based leadership, and customary law had established a resilient model of Saxon governance. While external powers such as the Franks would later codify and formalize aspects of these systems, during the period under discussion authority remained personal, situational, and negotiated through consensus. Archaeological continuity in settlement patterns, weapon distribution, and material culture corroborates textual evidence, highlighting the persistence of decentralized, kin-focused political organization. Belief systems, both pagan and emerging Christian practices, reinforced social order and provided the framework through which Saxon leaders exercised authority, shaping community cohesion and legitimizing customary law. Justice was measured in value, not imprisonment. Early Saxon legal culture was structured around compensation rather than punitive incarceration. Central to this system was the concept of wergild, a monetary or material payment assessed according to the social status of the victim. The wergild system provided a means of resolving conflicts between individuals or kin groups without resorting to cycles of revenge, maintaining social cohesion within decentralized communities. Archaeological evidence, including patterns of grave goods and settlement hierarchies, supports the textual record that social rank determined both obligations and penalties, reflecting a stratified but negotiable society. The distribution of wergild payments indicates the presence of distinct social tiers within Saxon communities. Free men, ferlingi, dependents, and slaves each held different legal valuations, with compensation for injury or death calibrated accordingly. This stratification is confirmed by archaeological findings, including the size and richness of domestic sites, weapon deposits, and burial differentiation. Wealth accumulation, while limited by local subsistence economies, reinforced social distinctions, allowing prominent households to exercise authority through both martial capability and economic influence. Land tenure was closely linked to legal and social frameworks. Rights to cultivate fields, graze livestock, and utilize common resources were regulated by customary law, enforced through assemblies and communal oversight. Archaeological surveys reveal long-term continuity in field systems and property boundaries, demonstrating a functional legal infrastructure operating without centralized administration. Ownership and access were negotiated locally, often contingent upon kinship affiliation, contributing to both stability and flexibility within Saxon society. Codified law, preserved in later manuscripts such as the Lex Saxonum and Capitularies, reflects the retrospective recording of these customary practices. While these texts postdate the period under study, they provide insight into the principles governing dispute resolution, compensation, and social obligations. Provisions for fines, restitution, and inheritance illustrate the interplay between legal custom and social hierarchy, demonstrating a pragmatic approach to governance rooted in consensus and negotiation rather than coercion. Marriage, inheritance, and family obligations were likewise regulated by customary law. Kin groups maintained internal authority over succession and property distribution, with wergild and compensation obligations extending to family members. Archaeological evidence from burial sites, including the placement of grave goods and the organization of cemeteries, corroborates textual accounts of family-based social structure and obligations. These legal practices reinforced kin-based governance and provided mechanisms for conflict resolution that preserved community stability. Disputes over resources or offenses between groups were similarly mediated through compensation. Assemblies, often composed of free men from multiple kin units, adjudicated such cases, determining appropriate fines or restitution. Archaeological concentrations of weapon deposits and defensive structures suggest that, while enforcement relied on social consensus, communities also maintained readiness for armed defense, highlighting the interdependence of legal, martial, and social frameworks. The integration of legal, economic, and social structures reinforced hierarchical differentiation while allowing flexibility. Prominent households were responsible for organizing communal resources, mediating disputes, and providing leadership during conflict. Their authority was underpinned by economic capacity, control of land, and participation in assemblies. Archaeological evidence, including the relative size of domestic sites, storage capacity, and proximity to ritual or assembly spaces, supports this model, demonstrating the tangible foundations of legal and social hierarchy within Saxon communities. The valuation system extended beyond personal injury to property and livestock. Compensation for damaged crops, stolen cattle, or destruction of tools was calculated based on both material worth and social context. This approach allowed communities to quantify loss in practical terms, maintaining social equilibrium and minimizing retaliatory violence. Archaeological remains of storage pits, field systems, and fenced enclosures provide insight into the tangible assets that formed the basis of these legal valuations, reinforcing the material foundation of customary law. Religious practice intersected with legal structures, lending legitimacy to decisions and reinforcing social cohesion. Sacrificial rites, oaths, and ritualized assemblies embedded legal obligations within moral and spiritual frameworks. Leaders who presided over such proceedings derived authority not solely from kinship or wealth but from their role in upholding customary and sacred order. Archaeological evidence of ritual deposits, sacrificial sites, and ceremonial objects supports the conclusion that law and religion were closely intertwined, providing a holistic system for regulating behavior and maintaining societal stability. By the end of the early medieval period, Saxon legal culture had established a resilient framework balancing hierarchy, compensation, and community enforcement. The integration of wergild, kin-based governance, and customary practices provided continuity despite political decentralization. Archaeological, textual, and material evidence together illustrate a pragmatic and adaptive system of justice, emphasizing social equilibrium and negotiated authority over formalized or coercive control. Religion and belief systems reinforced the legitimacy of Saxon authority, shaping the principles through which communities organized themselves, regulated behavior, and maintained cohesion. Saxon religion was embedded in landscape, not temples. Prior to Christianization, Saxon religious practice was deeply intertwined with the natural environment. Sacred groves, riverbanks, hills, and other prominent landscape features served as focal points for ritual observance. Archaeological investigations have identified deposits of weapons, ornaments, and food offerings in bogs, wells, and near river courses throughout northern Germany and the southern Netherlands. These ritual placements indicate deliberate acts of dedication, often in liminal or ecologically significant spaces, emphasizing a belief system rooted in the physical landscape rather than in constructed temples or monumental architecture. Deities central to Saxon cosmology included Woden, Thunor, and Tiw, each associated with specific aspects of life, warfare, and social order. Woden, often linked with leadership, magic, and prophecy, appears in later textual sources but finds corroboration in symbolic artifacts and iconography uncovered at cultic sites. Thunor, identified with thunder and strength, and Tiw, associated with justice and law, reflect functional dimensions of religious thought, connecting spiritual practice with social and martial life. Archaeologists have noted weapon deposits and ceremonial items at sites interpreted as altars or sacred spaces, suggesting that these deities were venerated in ways that reinforced community cohesion and normative behavior. Ritual practices encompassed both communal and elite activities. Depositions of iron and bronze objects in bogs or waterways, often deliberately bent or broken, indicate votive offerings intended to secure divine favor or mark significant events. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Schleswig-Holstein and Friesland demonstrates repeated deposition patterns over generations, suggesting continuity in ritual practice and intergenerational transmission of belief. The placement of offerings in ecologically significant locations also implies an integrated worldview in which natural forces, material culture, and spiritual agency were interconnected. Burial practices further illuminate religious ideology. Cremation and inhumation were performed according to status, age, and possibly kin affiliation, often accompanied by grave goods such as weapons, ornaments, and pottery. The presence of martial objects in burial contexts suggests a link between religious observance, social hierarchy, and warrior culture. Archaeologists have documented both individual and collective burials, indicating that ritual practice operated at multiple social levels and reinforced communal identity while maintaining differentiation within the group. Sacred landscapes also functioned as spaces for assembly, dispute resolution, and social regulation. Sites interpreted as cultic may have simultaneously hosted legal and political gatherings, suggesting a multifunctional integration of religion and governance. The intertwining of sacred and civic activity reinforced social cohesion, legitimized leadership, and provided frameworks for negotiating communal obligations. Archaeological patterns of artifact deposition, site reuse, and proximity to settlement clusters support this interpretation, demonstrating the practical as well as spiritual significance of ritual sites. Material culture offers further insight into religious thought. Iconography on fibulae, bracteates, and weaponry frequently incorporates symbolic motifs associated with divine protection or favor. Recurrent symbols, including depictions of animals or abstract patterns, may represent cosmological concepts or invoke specific deities. Metallurgical analyses and contextual placement of these items suggest deliberate curation and ritualized use, reinforcing the notion that spiritual practice permeated daily life, martial activity, and social interaction. Maritime and riverine contexts were also central to Saxon ritual. Deposits found in bogs, marshes, and riverbanks demonstrate intentional placement of objects, often corresponding with navigable waterways. These acts suggest both an understanding of water as a conduit for spiritual engagement and a practical connection between trade, navigation, and ritual. By embedding religious practice in natural corridors, Saxons maintained a spiritual connection to the landscapes that structured their economic and social life. Ritual continuity persisted alongside external pressures from neighboring Christianized groups and the expanding influence of the Franks. While textual records such as Adam of Bremen's accounts postdate this period, archaeological evidence demonstrates that traditional practices endured well into the early medieval era, particularly in more remote regions. Depositional continuity, iconographic persistence, and localized burial customs indicate a resilient religious system, capable of maintaining internal cohesion even as cultural and political contexts shifted. By the late 6th century, pagan religious practice remained a defining feature of Saxon identity. Embedded within the landscape, tied to natural cycles, and integrated with social and political structures, these beliefs provided both spiritual guidance and normative regulation. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that ritual, material culture, and social organization were inseparable, forming a cohesive worldview that shaped both communal and individual behavior. The introduction of Christianity, supported by missionary activity and external political pressures, would challenge and gradually transform these landscape-centered practices, reshaping Saxon religious and cultural identity in the centuries to follow. Conversion arrived with armies, not sermons. Between the 7th and 8th centuries, Saxon communities experienced increasing pressure to adopt Christianity, a process intertwined with political, military, and cultural transformations. Missionary activity, notably by Anglo-Saxon and Frankish clerics, aimed to introduce Christian doctrine and liturgical practices. Archaeological evidence, including early church foundations, burial orientation shifts, and imported ecclesiastical artifacts, documents the gradual penetration of Christian influence. However, these spiritual efforts occurred alongside, and were often enforced by, external political and military pressure, highlighting the inseparability of conversion from broader power dynamics. Frankish expansion under leaders such as Charlemagne provided both impetus and enforcement for Christianization. Textual sources, including the Royal Frankish Annals and Einhard's Vita Caroli Magni, describe campaigns against rebellious Saxon regions, emphasizing the dual objectives of subjugation and religious instruction. Military operations, ranging from punitive expeditions to forced resettlement, aimed to integrate Saxon territories into the Frankish political and ecclesiastical framework. Archaeological surveys identify fortifications and destruction layers contemporaneous with these campaigns, corroborating textual accounts and illustrating the material consequences of enforced conversion. Resistance to Christianization was widespread and multifaceted. Saxon communities employed armed opposition, strategic retreat, and ritual persistence to maintain pagan traditions. The Saxon Wars of the late 8th century, documented in Frankish chronicles, reflect prolonged and organized resistance, involving both local leaders and kin-based networks. Archaeological evidence of continued sacrificial deposits, grave goods, and non-Christian burial orientations during this period demonstrates the persistence of pre-Christian religious practice, even under external coercion. These findings confirm that Christianization was neither instantaneous nor uniform, but rather a contested and negotiated process. Missionary efforts, while sometimes accompanied by coercion, also utilized persuasion, negotiation, and institution building. The establishment of churches, monasteries, and episcopal centers provided both spiritual instruction and administrative oversight. Material evidence, including imported liturgical objects, stone church foundations, and cemetery reorganization, demonstrates the integration of Christian practice into existing settlement networks. These developments often overlapped with strategic Frankish interests, reinforcing political authority while promoting religious conformity. The transformation of burial customs provides particularly clear evidence of Christian influence. Cemeteries began to align graves along east-west axes, reflecting doctrinal emphasis on resurrection and salvation. In some areas, pagan traditions persisted alongside Christian elements, resulting in hybridized practices that illustrate the uneven adoption of new religious frameworks. Artifact assemblages in these burial contexts indicate selective retention of traditional material culture, suggesting that religious conversion was integrated gradually and variably at the community level. Christianization also reshaped legal and social frameworks. The introduction of canon law and ecclesiastically sanctioned penalties intersected with customary Saxon law, producing hybrid governance systems. Legal codifications from this period, preserved in later compilations, reflect new obligations related to tithes, church property, and clerical authority, signaling both spiritual and administrative integration. These measures reinforced Frankish dominance while providing a framework through which Saxon communities could negotiate their continued autonomy within the new religious paradigm. The interplay between conversion and military subjugation underscores the political dimensions of religious change. Leaders who resisted conversion risked punitive campaigns, exile, or execution, while cooperative elites secured recognition, territorial rights, and integration into Frankish administrative networks. Archaeological findings of fortified sites, burned settlements, and sudden shifts in settlement distribution corroborate textual descriptions of coercive enforcement. These patterns indicate that conversion was closely aligned with the imposition of political authority, reflecting the inseparability of faith and power during this period. Despite these pressures, Saxon communities retained elements of their cultural identity. Ritual deposits, localized artistic motifs, and continued use of traditional settlement patterns demonstrate the persistence of social and religious norms. Material culture indicates selective adoption of Christian elements, with communities negotiating the integration of new religious structures without fully abandoning indigenous practices. This duality reflects both pragmatic adaptation and resistance, highlighting the complexity of cultural transformation under external imposition. By the end of the 8th century, Christianization had become more widespread, particularly under continued Frankish oversight. The process reshaped Saxon political alignment, integrating previously autonomous communities into the ecclesiastical and administrative structures of the Frankish Empire. Archaeological and textual evidence together demonstrate that conversion was neither purely spiritual nor voluntary, but a complex interplay of coercion, negotiation, and gradual assimilation. The persistence of older traditions alongside new religious practices illustrates the adaptive strategies of Saxon communities navigating imposed political and spiritual frameworks. With Christian faith increasingly institutionalized, Saxon society experienced a reorganization of political, social, and cultural norms, providing the foundation for early medieval governance and territorial consolidation. The Saxon economy was local, resilient, and adaptive. Saxon communities relied primarily on subsistence agriculture, employing practices adapted to the diverse landscapes of northern Germany, the southern Netherlands, and eastern England. Archaeological surveys reveal the predominance of mixed farming, combining cereal cultivation with livestock management. Excavated field systems, storage pits, and remnants of wooden implements indicate the cultivation of barley, wheat, and rye, alongside the maintenance of cattle, pigs, and sheep. Seasonal cycles structured both labor and settlement patterns, dictating periods of sowing, harvesting, and livestock movement, and forming the backbone of local economic stability. Domestic craft production complemented agricultural subsistence. Excavations at settlement sites reveal evidence of pottery manufacture, ironworking, and textile production. Kilns, slag deposits, and weaving tools indicate that communities were largely self-sufficient in essential commodities. Tools for plowing, harvesting, and food processing demonstrate technological continuity with earlier Iron Age practices, adapted to local environmental conditions. The integration of craft production with agriculture ensured that settlements could maintain stable populations while sustaining economic resilience in the face of environmental variability. Land management was organized through kin-based ownership and communal oversight. Settlement clusters often correspond with delineated agricultural plots, where extended families coordinated cultivation and resource allocation. Archaeological evidence, including ditches, embankments, and drainage systems, demonstrates strategic adaptation to marshlands and floodplains. These practices optimized agricultural productivity while minimizing vulnerability to seasonal flooding, reflecting both environmental knowledge and community coordination. Storage and surplus played a significant role in local economies. Granaries, pits, and elevated platforms preserved crops, while livestock management strategies ensured continuity of food supply throughout the year. Archaeological traces of storage facilities reveal careful planning to mitigate risks from spoilage, pests, and climatic variation. This management of surplus allowed for social flexibility, enabling households to support dependents, engage in local exchange, and contribute to communal obligations. Social differentiation is evident in the scale and organization of production. Larger farmsteads, often associated with richer grave assemblages, suggest households with increased control over labor, land, and craft production. These prominent households functioned as local centers for both economic coordination and social leadership, mediating disputes, managing surplus distribution, and organizing collective labor for seasonal tasks. Material evidence demonstrates that these households maintained both domestic and ritual spaces, integrating economic and social authority. Animal husbandry extended beyond food production, contributing to transport, plowing, and artisanal activity. Horse and oxen remains indicate draft use, while secondary products, such as wool and hides, supported textile production and leatherworking. Archaeological evidence of bone tools, weaving combs, and leatherworking implements highlights the integration of livestock and craft into broader economic systems. These practices created diversified local economies capable of adapting to environmental and social change. Subsistence strategies were closely tied to seasonal and ecological conditions. Coastal and riverine areas provided additional resources through fishing, shellfish collection, and limited salt extraction. Archaeological finds of fish traps, net weights, and shell middens document exploitation of aquatic environments, demonstrating an adaptive approach to resource management. These supplementary activities enhanced food security and supported trade, both locally and with neighboring regions. Craft specialization facilitated limited exchange within and between settlements. Pottery styles, metal tools, and ornaments reveal both local production and occasional importation of prestige goods, reflecting the integration of small-scale trade into subsistence economies. Such exchanges strengthened social networks, reinforced status hierarchies, and enabled communities to acquire resources or objects unavailable locally. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that these interactions were modest but meaningful, providing both economic and social value. By the end of the early medieval period, Saxon agriculture and local production had established a stable and resilient economic base. Communities maintained autonomy through kin-based organization, diversified subsistence strategies, and integrated craft production. Archaeological continuity in field systems, domestic tools, and settlement patterns indicates sustained adaptation to environmental and social conditions. These economic foundations would support broader trade networks and facilitate the emergence of more complex political structures. The integration of local production with emerging exchange networks expanded Saxon influence beyond immediate settlements, linking communities through trade and fostering interregional connectivity. The sea connected what land divided. From the 5th through the 8th centuries, Saxon communities engaged in a network of maritime and riverine trade that extended across the North Sea, linking northern Germany, Frisia, Scandinavia, and Britain. Archaeological evidence, including imported ceramics, glassware, coins, and metal objects, demonstrates active participation in both regional and interregional exchange. Coastal settlements, particularly along the Elbe, Weser, and Ems rivers, functioned as hubs for the movement of goods, enabling communities to access resources unavailable locally and to participate in wider economic networks. Trade encompassed both essential commodities and prestige items. Salt, iron, textiles, and agricultural surplus were exchanged for luxury goods such as silver ornaments, imported pottery, and fine metalwork. Excavations of hoards and port sites, including finds of Frankish and Anglo-Saxon coins, indicate that both barter and monetary exchange facilitated commercial activity. Such interactions strengthened social networks, reinforced political alliances, and allowed prominent households to consolidate economic and social influence within the community. Maritime technology played a critical role in sustaining these networks. Archaeological remains of boats, rudimentary docks, and ship fittings demonstrate the capacity for coastal navigation, river transport, and short sea voyages. The ability to move goods efficiently along waterways enabled Saxon communities to overcome limitations imposed by overland travel and terrain. These logistical capacities contributed to the resilience of trade networks, ensuring the flow of resources and fostering interregional connectivity. Frisia and the Frisian coast served as key intermediaries in North Sea trade. The exchange of commodities, cultural knowledge, and technological innovations facilitated both economic and social integration. Archaeological evidence from Frisian settlements, including imported ceramics, metal objects, and coins, demonstrates reciprocal interaction with Saxon communities. Such connectivity allowed Saxons to acquire prestige goods while contributing locally produced items, including agricultural surplus and craft products, to broader exchange networks. Interaction with Britain continued alongside migration and settlement. Coastal trade facilitated the movement of agricultural products, tools, and raw materials, while maritime raiding provided additional channels for the redistribution of wealth. Archaeological finds of Anglo-Saxon artifacts in continental Saxon contexts suggest ongoing engagement with British communities, both through commerce and contact maintained by kinship networks. These interactions reinforced social, economic, and cultural bonds across the North Sea, underscoring the maritime orientation of Saxon society. Scandinavia also participated in exchange networks with continental Saxons. Evidence of imported Scandinavian metalwork, ornaments, and craft styles indicates reciprocal influence and occasional mobility. Such interactions facilitated the transmission of technological innovations, artistic motifs, and social practices, contributing to a shared material culture across the North Sea region. Maritime trade thus functioned not only as an economic conduit but also as a mechanism for cultural integration and knowledge transfer. The benefits of trade extended beyond material wealth. Accumulated resources provided the means to support martial activities, including defense, raiding, and intergroup competition. Archaeological evidence of weapon deposits, fortified sites, and settlement clusters demonstrates that economic capacity underpinned military readiness. Trade-generated wealth enabled the mobilization of men, procurement of armaments, and construction of defensive infrastructure, linking economic success directly to political and military influence. Control over trade routes also reinforced social hierarchies within Saxon communities. Prominent households, often located near river mouths or estuaries, acted as intermediaries in exchange networks. By facilitating access to resources, regulating trade, and distributing goods, these households consolidated both economic and political authority. Archaeological evidence, including settlement size, storage capacity, and proximity to ritual or assembly spaces, supports the conclusion that trade contributed to hierarchical differentiation within otherwise decentralized societies. Trade networks were dynamic, responsive to both environmental and political conditions. Storms, shifting river courses, and coastal changes required adaptability, while political alliances and conflicts influenced access to markets and resources. Archaeological continuity in port settlements, hoards, and imported material reflects sustained engagement despite episodic disruption, demonstrating the resilience and strategic management of Saxon maritime commerce. By the 8th century, North Sea trade had become integral to Saxon society, linking local production to regional networks and enabling the accumulation of wealth that could be leveraged for political and military purposes. Archaeological, textual, and material evidence indicates that commerce was both practical and strategic, shaping social hierarchies, reinforcing community cohesion, and connecting Saxon settlements to the broader North Sea world. The accumulation of wealth from trade and local production provided the resources necessary to sustain military organization, enabling Saxon communities to defend territory, assert autonomy, and project influence across the region. War defined status and survival. Saxon military organization during the early medieval period was closely tied to kinship structures and local leadership rather than centralized state authority. Armed conflict was conducted by men obligated through familial and community networks, forming tribal militias capable of both defense and offensive operations. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits, settlement fortifications, and burial contexts demonstrates the prevalence of martial equipment and the integration of combat readiness into everyday life. Spears, swords, shields, and axes were the most common arms, reflecting both the technological capabilities and tactical preferences of Saxon warriors. Leadership within these armed groups was situational and merit-based. War leaders emerged from prominent households or demonstrated prowess, gaining recognition through experience, martial skill, and social influence. Textual sources, including Frankish chronicles and later Saxon law codes, describe such leaders coordinating raids, defending territory, and negotiating alliances. Archaeological evidence of larger weapon caches near certain homesteads and cemeteries indicates that leadership was materially reinforced, with elite households possessing superior arms, armor, and resources to mobilize kin and retainers. Tactics employed by Saxon forces were shaped by geography and settlement patterns. Coastal raids exploited navigable rivers and estuaries, enabling swift attacks and withdrawal, while inland defense relied on natural obstacles such as marshes, forests, and riverbanks. Excavations of hill forts and palisade sites reveal adaptations to localized threats, demonstrating the capacity for both mobile warfare and static defense. The integration of knowledge about terrain with weaponry and manpower allowed Saxons to operate effectively against neighboring groups and, later, against imperial forces such as the Franks. Raiding played a central role in Saxon martial activity. Maritime and riverine incursions provided both economic gain and social prestige. Archaeological evidence of coastal hordes, imported artifacts, and weapon assemblages supports textual accounts of episodic raiding along the North Sea and Channel coasts. These activities reinforced status hierarchies within communities, as warriors who demonstrated success in raids accrued wealth, influence, and authority. Raiding also functioned as a mechanism of political negotiation, enabling decentralized groups to assert presence without formal territorial control. Weapon technology was both functional and symbolic. Spearheads, swords, and axes were manufactured for durability and effectiveness, while ornamentation on hilts, pommels, and shield bosses conveyed social standing. Metallurgical analysis reveals a combination of local production and imported materials, reflecting both technological continuity and access to wider trade networks. The distribution of weapons in graves and hoards indicates their dual role in life and death, signifying both martial readiness and social identity. Defensive strategies extended beyond individual settlements. Temporary fortifications, watchposts, and river crossings illustrate collective organization in response to external threats. Archaeological evidence of ditches, palisades, and embankments demonstrates that even decentralized communities could coordinate resources and labor to enhance security. Such fortifications were flexible, often temporary or adaptive, reflecting the situational and negotiated nature of Saxon defense. Training and martial culture were integrated into socialization. Young men acquired proficiency through hunting, communal exercises, and participation in local conflict. Weapon caches and training tools found at settlements suggest that skill development was both practical and ritualized, contributing to cohesion, intergenerational continuity, and community identity. Textual references emphasize the role of oaths, fealty, and ritual in reinforcing obligations, illustrating the integration of social, spiritual, and martial frameworks. Interaction with neighboring powers influenced Saxon military organization. Engagements with the Franks, Thuringians, and other Germanic groups prompted adaptation in tactics, weaponry, and leadership structures. Archaeological evidence of imported armor, cross-cultural weapon styles, and fortified settlements demonstrates both selective adoption and innovation. Such adaptations allowed Saxons to maintain autonomy while engaging effectively in both defensive and offensive operations within a competitive geopolitical landscape. Logistical considerations underpinned military activity. Seasonal mobilization, provisioning of warriors, and coordination of riverine and overland movement required planning and resource allocation. Settlement patterns, storage pits, and proximity to navigable waterways indicate that communities structured their economy and labor to support martial capability. These practices highlight the integration of military preparedness into broader social and economic organization, ensuring that Saxons could respond to both external threats and opportunities for expansion. By the late 8th century, Saxon military organization reflected a balance between decentralization, kin-based leadership, and tactical innovation. Weaponry, fortifications, and social structures provided the means to project force, defend territory, and engage in interregional exchange. Archaeological, textual, and material evidence together illustrates a martial culture deeply embedded in social hierarchy, economic capacity, and environmental adaptation. The martial organization of Saxon society set the stage for intensified conflict with neighboring empires, particularly the expanding Frankish state, linking warfare directly to political negotiation, territorial control, and social cohesion. Imperial conquest met tribal resistance. Between 772 and 804 CE, Saxon territories were the focus of sustained military campaigns led by Charlemagne, marking one of the most prolonged and documented conflicts of early medieval Europe. Textual sources, including the Royal Frankish Annals and Einhard's Vita Caroli Magni, chronicle a series of campaigns aimed at subjugating Saxon tribes, enforcing Christianization, and integrating the region into the Carolingian Empire. These sources, while composed from a Frankish perspective, correspond closely with archaeological evidence of settlement disruption, fortification construction, and weapon deposition, providing a multidimensional view of the conflicts. The campaigns were motivated by both political and religious objectives. Charlemagne sought to expand imperial control northward while simultaneously imposing ecclesiastical structures. Missionary activity accompanied military expeditions, reinforcing the connection between conquest and conversion. Archaeological evidence of early church foundations, mass graves, and burned settlements suggests that the Saxons faced both armed suppression and enforced religious transformation. The combination of coercion and strategic institution building exemplifies the integration of military and administrative methods in Carolingian expansion. Saxon resistance was characterized by both conventional and irregular warfare. Tribes utilized knowledge of local terrain, marshes, and river networks to launch ambushes, conduct raids, and evade larger imperial forces. Fortified hilltops, palisade villages, and temporary encampments provided defensive strongholds, as documented in archaeological surveys along the Weser and Elbe regions. Weapon caches and skeletal trauma evidence demonstrate the intensity of engagements and the prevalence of close-quarter combat. Resistance was not continuous but episodic, reflecting the decentralized nature of Saxon society and the difficulty of maintaining coordinated opposition over extended campaigns. Leadership during the Saxon Wars emerged from prominent kin groups and regional coalitions. War leaders coordinated mobilization, resource allocation, and strategic planning, leveraging both social prestige and practical knowledge of the environment. Textual records highlight figures such as Widukind, who became emblematic of Saxon resistance, while archaeological evidence of high-status burial goods and weapon concentrations corroborates the prominence of certain households in sustaining military opposition. These leaders acted within negotiated kin-based frameworks rather than centralized authority, maintaining cohesion through personal influence and alliance networks. Military tactics integrated mobility, surprise, and environmental advantage. Riverine and coastal routes facilitated both defensive maneuvering and limited offensive action. Raiding, ambush, and withdrawal were preferred strategies, minimizing exposure to superior Frankish forces while inflicting material and psychological pressure. Archaeological evidence, including disrupted settlements and targeted weapon deposits, suggests that these tactics effectively prolonged resistance, despite the strategic advantage held by the Carolingian army. The Frankish response combined sustained military campaigns with administrative consolidation. Fortifications were established in strategic locations to control river crossings, monitor local populations, and provide bases for subsequent operations. Charlemagne's campaigns often involved scorched earth tactics, including destruction of crops and settlements, to undermine Saxon logistical capacity. Archaeological traces of burned structures, abandoned villages, and reoccupied sites corroborate textual descriptions, illustrating the material impact of imperial warfare on Saxon communities. Religious enforcement was closely linked to military activity. Christianization was imposed through missionary oversight, establishment of ecclesiastical centers, and coercive conversion mandates. Pagan sacred sites, including groves and ritual deposits, were systematically targeted, reflecting the strategic integration of spiritual and political subjugation. Archaeological evidence of desecrated ritual sites, combined with shifts in burial orientation and grave goods, demonstrates the tangible imposition of Christian norms alongside Frankish political authority. Despite sustained pressure, Saxon communities adapted and negotiated survival. Temporary truces, localized compliance, and strategic retreat allowed continuity of social structures while mitigating losses. Archaeological continuity in settlement patterns, grave orientations, and material culture indicates that, although severely disrupted, Saxon communities retained elements of their identity. These adaptive strategies reflect the resilience of decentralized political organization and the capacity to maintain cultural cohesion under external domination. By the conclusion of the Saxon Wars in 804 CE, the region was formally incorporated into the Carolingian Empire, with both political and religious structures aligned with Frankish governance. The defeat reshaped Saxon identity, merging elements of local custom with imposed legal, military, and ecclesiastical frameworks. Archaeological and textual evidence together demonstrate a negotiated transition, wherein remnants of traditional practices persisted alongside new institutional norms, establishing a foundation for early medieval Saxon society under imperial oversight. With the integration of Saxon territories into the Carolingian Empire, political, economic, and religious restructuring created conditions for the emergence of a unified territorial identity and the consolidation of social hierarchy. Defeat brought transformation, not disappearance. Following the conclusion of the Saxon Wars in 804 CE, Saxon territories were formally incorporated into the Carolingian Empire. Political integration involved the establishment of imperial administrative structures, the imposition of Frankish law, and the coordination of local elites into the imperial hierarchy. Textual evidence from the Royal Frankish Annals documents the creation of counties, the appointment of counts, and the regulation of tribute and military service. These administrative measures formalized authority while enabling the Frankish state to monitor compliance, enforce Christianization, and consolidate territorial control. Local governance relied on the co-option of prominent Saxon households into Carolingian administrative frameworks. Kin-based leaders retained influence over their communities, now functioning as intermediaries between imperial authority and local populations. Archaeological evidence of settlement continuity, fortified centers, and high-status domestic structures supports textual descriptions, indicating that while political autonomy was curtailed, traditional social hierarchies remained relevant under the new regime. Legal integration accompanied political restructuring. Saxon customary law was codified and adapted under Frankish supervision, producing hybrid legal systems. Textual sources, including the Lex Saxonum, outline obligations related to tribute, military service, and ecclesiastical oversight while retaining provisions for kin-based dispute resolution and compensation practices such as wergild. This combination of imperial standardization and localized custom ensured both compliance and continuity, reinforcing social stability while embedding Saxons within the broader Carolingian legal order. Military obligations were formalized within the imperial framework. Saxon warriors were integrated into the Carolingian levy system, providing manpower for campaigns beyond regional defense. Archaeological evidence, including weapon deposits, fortified sites, and ceremonial hoards, suggests that martial identity persisted even as obligations shifted from tribal mobilization to imperial service. The coordination of military resources further solidified Saxon participation in the political and strategic framework of the Carolingian state. Christianization and ecclesiastical administration played a central role in integration. The establishment of bishoprics, monasteries, and parochial networks facilitated both religious conformity and territorial oversight. Archaeological remains of early churches, associated cemeteries, and liturgical objects demonstrate the spread of Christian practice alongside administrative structures. Missionaries and clerics served dual roles, providing spiritual guidance while acting as agents of imperial governance, embedding Saxon communities within Carolingian institutional frameworks. Economic reorganization supported political consolidation. Tribute, taxation, and tithe systems redirected resources toward imperial priorities while maintaining local production. Archaeological evidence of storage facilities, field organization, and craft production indicates continuity in subsistence strategies, even as surplus contributed to broader economic networks. Trade and local markets were increasingly integrated with Carolingian circulation, linking Saxon settlements to regional and interregional exchange. Cultural and social synthesis accompanied these transformations. Carolingian influence introduced new material culture, administrative practices, and religious norms, which combined with indigenous Saxon customs to produce hybridized social forms. Archaeological and textual evidence reveals the selective adoption of Frankish artifacts, burial patterns, and settlement arrangements, reflecting both adaptation and the persistence of local identity. Such synthesis facilitated the stabilization of society while preserving elements of pre-conquest social organization. By the mid-9th century, Saxon territories exhibited both continuity and transformation. Kin-based elites continued to wield local authority, while imperial structures provided oversight, legal standardization, and integration into wider networks. Settlement patterns, material culture, and burial practices indicate that Saxon identity remained distinct, even as communities participated fully in Carolingian political, military, and ecclesiastical systems. This duality of adaptation and persistence underscores the complex nature of early medieval integration. With political structures consolidated, cultural, religious, and economic integration fostered a synthesis that shaped Saxon society for subsequent centuries, producing new forms of territorial and communal identity. Saxon power peaked in kingdoms, not tribes. By the 8th and 9th centuries, Anglo-Saxon society had evolved from decentralized tribal groupings into organized kingdoms, including Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria. Political consolidation allowed these kingdoms to exercise centralized authority, coordinate military action, and regulate economic and religious life. Archaeological and textual evidence, such as the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, charters, and fortified burghs, illustrates the institutional sophistication and territorial reach achieved during this period. The emergence of royal dynasties provided continuity, legitimacy, and the capacity to project influence beyond local communities. Wessex, situated in southern England, demonstrated both administrative innovation and military strength. Excavations of royal estates, fortified centers, and burials indicate hierarchical structures supporting centralized governance. Kings maintained control through networks of loyal nobles, who oversaw land tenure, resource allocation, and local justice. Evidence from coinage, trade goods, and luxury items illustrates economic vitality, while ecclesiastical institutions reinforced royal authority, providing both spiritual legitimacy and administrative oversight. Mercia, dominating the Midlands, exercised influence through strategic diplomacy, military campaigns, and control of key trade routes. Archaeological findings reveal fortified settlements, palisade villages, and evidence of iron production, indicating a capacity to sustain both economic activity and martial readiness. Charters and law codes preserved from this period document the regulation of land, tribute, and social obligations, demonstrating a complex legal framework that balanced royal authority with local autonomy. Military mobilization was coordinated through kinship networks and administrative hierarchies, enabling the kingdom to respond effectively to both internal unrest and external threats. Northumbria, in the north, combined cultural and religious innovation with territorial expansion. Monastic centers such as Lindisfarne and York played dual roles as spiritual hubs and repositories of knowledge, supporting literacy, record-keeping, and legal codification. Archaeological evidence of imported manuscripts, ecclesiastical metalwork, and fortified royal sites illustrates both the integration of continental influence and the maintenance of distinct northern identity. The kingdom's political organization relied on both centralized kingship and regional subkings, reflecting continuity with older tribal structures while adapting to the demands of territorial governance. Military organization across these kingdoms reflected both internal and external pressures. Fortified burghs, strategically located along rivers and trade routes, allowed rulers to control movement, protect economic centers, and coordinate defense. Archaeological excavations of ramparts, ditches, and gatehouses confirm the extensive investment in defensive infrastructure, highlighting the interplay between settlement planning, military preparedness, and political authority. Warrior elites, drawn from noble households, provided the manpower necessary for expeditions, raiding, and territorial defense, integrating martial activity into the fabric of governance and social hierarchy. Economic integration strengthened the authority of these kingdoms. Agriculture, craft production, and trade provided surplus resources to support royal households, ecclesiastical institutions, and military operations. Coinage, imported goods, and local artisanal production demonstrate active participation in interregional exchange, linking Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the North Sea and continental Europe. Administrative oversight of tribute, land tenure, and resource management facilitated the efficient allocation of wealth, ensuring both the sustainability of the kingdom and the reinforcement of hierarchical structures. Religion continued to play a central role in consolidating authority and shaping cultural identity. Christian institutions, integrated into royal administration, regulated social norms, education, and legal practice. Monastic networks facilitated the standardization of liturgy, the preservation of legal codes, and the dissemination of literacy. Archaeological evidence of church foundations, burial patterns, and ecclesiastical artifacts demonstrates that spiritual oversight reinforced both social cohesion and political legitimacy, linking secular authority with religious sanction. Cultural achievements reflected both internal dynamism and external influence. Manuscripts, metalwork, and architecture reveal syncretic integration of continental Carolingian styles with local artistic traditions. Burial practices, settlement layouts, and material culture illustrate continuity with earlier Saxon forms while adapting to the administrative, military, and religious demands of kingdom-based society. This synthesis of tradition and innovation provided stability, identity, and cohesion during periods of both expansion and external pressure. By the late 9th century, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had reached a peak of political organization, military capability, and cultural development. Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria demonstrated the potential of centralized authority to coordinate resources, maintain social order, and respond to external threats. Archaeological and textual evidence together illustrate a society capable of integrating local traditions into broader institutional frameworks, achieving both resilience and adaptability. Despite this period of consolidation, external pressures, particularly Viking incursions from the late 8th century onward, would once again challenge Saxon autonomy, reshaping the trajectory of kingdoms and influencing the development of early medieval England. The North Sea world turned inward on itself. From the late 8th century onward, Saxon kingdoms faced increasing pressure from Viking raiders originating in Scandinavia. Initial incursions targeted coastal monasteries, trade centers, and riverine settlements, exploiting the navigable waterways that had previously facilitated Saxon commerce. Archaeological evidence, including burned settlements, disrupted cemeteries, and weapon deposits, documents the material impact of these attacks. Textual sources, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Frankish Annals, describe recurring raids that destabilized both political authority and economic networks, creating conditions for fragmentation and localized vulnerability. Viking activity imposed both direct and indirect pressures on Saxon political structures. Recurrent raids undermined central authority by disrupting tribute collection, weakening military organization, and challenging the ability of kings to enforce law and order. Settlement patterns adapted accordingly. Fortified burghs were constructed along rivers and coastal approaches, while interior communities consolidated resources and labor for defense. Archaeological evidence confirms a marked increase in fortification activity, including ditches, ramparts, and palisades, demonstrating strategic response to the threat of sudden attack. Economic disruption was a central consequence of Viking pressure. Coastal and riverine trade suffered from episodic depredation, reducing access to imported goods and limiting the redistribution of agricultural surplus. Coin hoards buried during this period suggest attempts to protect wealth from raiders, while archaeological traces of abandoned or restructured settlements indicate population displacement and resource scarcity. These changes not only constrained local economies but also stressed the administrative capacity of Saxon rulers, weakening centralized control. Political fragmentation accelerated as Viking incursions intensified. Smaller regional leaders gained autonomy as the ability of kings to enforce authority diminished. Textual sources indicate that sub-kings and ealdormen exercised increased discretion in military mobilization, taxation, and law enforcement, reflecting a decentralized response to external threat. Archaeological evidence, including fortified minor settlements and defensive modifications in previously unfortified villages, supports the conclusion that localized authority expanded at the expense of centralized governance. Military adaptation was both reactive and strategic. Saxon forces focused on rapid mobilization, utilization of natural terrain for defense, and coordination between burghs to resist raids. Shipbuilding and riverine patrols supplemented fortifications, enabling partial control of waterways. Archaeological finds of weapon caches, ship remnants, and temporary encampments illustrate the integration of mobility and fortification in defensive strategy. Despite these efforts, repeated Viking attacks demonstrated the limitations of decentralized military organization against a highly mobile and coordinated maritime adversary. Cultural and social strain accompanied political instability. Communities under repeated attack often modified settlement layouts, burial practices, and material culture in ways that reflect both defensive priorities and social continuity. Evidence of hybridized artifacts, including local metalwork combined with imported Scandinavian styles, suggests contact and adaptation even amidst conflict. These patterns reveal the dual impact of disruption: the erosion of political cohesion, coupled with selective integration of external influences. The threat of Viking incursion also shaped religious and symbolic behavior. Monastic sites, which had previously served as centers of learning and spiritual authority, became both targets and refuges. Archaeological evidence of burned monastic complexes, combined with textual descriptions of relic preservation and relocation, demonstrates the role of religious institutions in both vulnerability and resilience. Clerics and communities coordinated defensive measures while maintaining spiritual practice, illustrating the integration of faith and survival under stress. By the late 9th century, Saxon kingdoms had experienced repeated cycles of incursion, disruption, and localized adaptation. Fragmentation of authority, economic strain, and military pressure collectively weakened the coherence of previously centralized kingdoms. Textual and archaeological evidence indicates that while local elites maintained influence, overarching political integration was compromised, creating conditions in which conquest by external powers became increasingly feasible. With internal fragmentation and sustained external pressure, Saxon territories were vulnerable to conquest, ultimately resulting in incorporation into emergent imperial and Viking-influenced polities that reshaped the political landscape of early medieval northern Europe. 1066 ended Saxon rule, but not Saxon influence. The Norman conquest of 1066 marked the definitive end of independent Saxon political dominance in England. The invasion, led by William of Normandy, culminated in the Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066, where King Harold II was killed and Anglo-Saxon forces decisively defeated. Contemporary sources, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Bayeux Tapestry, and Norman administrative records, provide detailed accounts of the military engagements, strategic maneuvers, and immediate political aftermath. Archaeological evidence, including battlefield finds, fortifications, and post-conquest settlements, corroborates these accounts, illustrating the transformative impact on both the political and material landscape of England. The battle itself exemplified the tactical superiority of Norman forces, which combined cavalry, archery, and infantry in coordinated maneuvers. Saxon troops, organized largely under the FYRD system and shield wall tactics, relied on infantry cohesion and defensive positioning. Archaeological finds of weapons, armor fragments, and mass graves confirm the scale of the conflict and the intensity of combat. Despite formidable resistance, Saxon forces were outmaneuvered by the mobility and strategic planning of the Normans, demonstrating the limitations of traditional Anglo-Saxon military organization against a combined arms force. Following the conquest, William implemented a systematic consolidation of authority across England. Castles were constructed at strategic locations to control movement, enforce royal authority, and defend against residual uprisings. Archaeological studies reveal the rapid development of motte and bailey fortifications, urban centers, and administrative hubs, illustrating the imposition of Norman governance structures over previously Saxon-controlled territories. These fortifications not only provided military security but also served as centers for taxation, legal administration, and the integration of local populations into the Norman feudal system. The administrative reorganization under Norman rule replaced much of the Saxon elite with Norman nobles while retaining aspects of existing local structures. Land surveys, including the Domesday Book of 1086, recorded the redistribution of estates, detailing both the displacement of Saxon lords and the continuity of peasant labor. This dual pattern of disruption and continuity illustrates the complex social and economic integration that followed conquest, balancing Norman political control with the practical administration of Saxon communities. Cultural and linguistic impact followed closely behind political change. Norman French became the language of the court, law, and administration, while Anglo-Saxon vernacular persisted among the wider population. Archaeological evidence of continued settlement patterns, domestic architecture, and artisanal production demonstrates that Saxon material culture endured, even as elite political structures were replaced. The synthesis of Norman and Saxon elements contributed to the formation of a hybrid English identity, blending pre-existing social norms with new institutional frameworks. Resistance to Norman authority persisted in the immediate post-conquest period. Rebellions, such as those in the north of England, were met with military suppression, often involving widespread destruction of settlements and redistribution of land. Archaeological traces of burned villages, modified fortifications, and defensive earthworks corroborate textual accounts of punitive campaigns. These measures reinforced Norman dominance while gradually stabilizing the integration of Saxon territories into the emergent political order. Religious institutions both adapted and reinforced the new regime. Monastic centers, previously under Saxon patronage, were reorganized under Norman abbots and bishops, introducing new liturgical practices and architectural styles. Archaeological evidence of reconstructed churches, cloisters, and ecclesiastical artifacts indicates continuity of religious practice, albeit under revised institutional oversight. Clerical structures played a central role in legitimizing Norman authority, facilitating the transition of Saxon communities into the new socio-political framework. Economically, the conquest reinforced feudal obligations while maintaining the productivity of Saxon agricultural and artisanal systems. Land tenure was reorganized to ensure loyalty to the crown, while peasants continued traditional cultivation, craft production, and trade. Archaeological evidence of continued farmstead occupation, craft workshops, and local markets demonstrates that, despite the replacement of the political elite, the economic foundation of Saxon society persisted and adapted to the new hierarchical framework. By the end of the 11th century, Saxon political structures had been largely supplanted by Norman institutions, yet Saxon influence endured in multiple domains. Administrative practices, legal customs, settlement patterns, and cultural traditions were retained and adapted within the new order. Archaeological continuity in domestic architecture, burial rites, and material culture underscores the persistence of Saxon identity at the community level, even as formal sovereignty passed to the Norman elite. Although Saxons no longer wielded political power, their social, cultural, and economic legacy continued to shape England, bridging the early medieval period with the emerging structures of the High Middle Ages. The Saxons outlived their kingdoms. Despite the disappearance of independent Saxon polities, their cultural and linguistic influence persisted across both England and northern Germany. Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, embedded in codes such as the laws of Ethelbert, Alfred, and the laws of the West Saxons, provided a foundation for English common law. These codes codified kin-based compensation systems, land tenure rights, and social obligations, emphasizing compensation and negotiated resolution over punitive incarceration. Archaeological corroboration, including estate boundaries, domestic structures, and settlement organization, demonstrates the continued practice of these legal norms well beyond the collapse of political autonomy. Language represents a central axis of Saxon legacy. In England, Old English, derived from West Saxon and Anglian dialects, formed the basis of the modern English language. Place names, inscriptions, and literary works, such as Beowulf, preserve linguistic structures and vocabulary that endure to the present. In northern Germany, the Low Saxon dialect continuum retained distinct phonological, syntactic, and lexical features, influencing regional identity and local administration. These linguistic continuities reflect both demographic persistence and the integration of Saxon-speaking populations into subsequent political entities. Social structures inherited from Saxon society also shaped medieval and early modern communities. Kinship networks, local assemblies, and rural hierarchies provided frameworks for governance, resource distribution, and conflict resolution. Archaeological evidence of longhouse organization, farmsteads, and communal infrastructure demonstrates continuity in settlement patterns and social management. Even under Norman or Frankish political systems, Saxon modes of household organization and localized leadership contributed to resilience, enabling communities to maintain social cohesion while adapting to centralized authority. Religious and educational institutions further transmitted Saxon cultural norms. Monastic centers, parish networks, and scriptoria preserved literacy, record-keeping, and legal practice. Archaeological excavations of early churches, monasteries, and manuscript repositories indicate that the integration of Christian institutions reinforced continuity in both cultural practice and governance. Saxon ecclesiastical foundations served as intermediaries between local populations and broader political structures, ensuring that regional customs persisted within imperial or Norman frameworks. Economic organization also reflects Saxon influence. Landholding patterns, field systems, and artisanal production retained elements of pre-conquest practice. Archaeological surveys reveal that farmsteads continued traditional crop rotations and animal husbandry, while craft specialization and local trade persisted alongside feudal obligations. These patterns demonstrate the capacity of Saxon economic structures to adapt to changing political contexts, contributing to both regional stability and long-term prosperity. Material culture further illustrates enduring Saxon identity. Burial practices, domestic artifacts, and craftwork display continuity of design, technique, and symbolism. Excavated jewelry, metalwork, and household implements reveal both preservation of traditional forms and selective incorporation of external influences. This combination of continuity and adaptation highlights the dynamic interaction between local heritage and incoming political, religious, and cultural forces, underscoring the resilience of Saxon identity in everyday life. Historical memory also preserved Saxon legacy. Chronicles, genealogies, and legal commentaries maintained reference to Saxon leaders, laws, and societal organization. These textual records, alongside archaeological continuity, informed later constructions of regional identity in England and Germany, shaping both medieval historiography and modern interpretations of Saxon heritage. Place names, folklore, and literary motifs perpetuated Saxon social and cultural frameworks, embedding them within collective consciousness long after political independence had ceased. By the high medieval period, elements of Saxon governance, law, language, and social organization had been fully integrated into emergent national structures. In England, Anglo-Saxon legal principles influenced Norman and later common law traditions, while Old English provided the linguistic substrate for Middle English. In northern Germany, Low Saxon dialects, customary law, and communal institutions persisted under Holy Roman Empire administration. Archaeological and textual evidence together confirms that Saxon cultural persistence was both structural and adaptive, ensuring that identity endured in functional and symbolic forms. Modern historical scholarship, drawing on archaeology, linguistics, and textual analysis, continues to reassess Saxon contributions, revealing the enduring impact of their legal, linguistic, and social structures on subsequent European development. History clarifies what legend obscures. Modern scholarship on the Saxons has shifted from early nationalistic or romanticized narratives toward evidence-based, interdisciplinary analysis. Historians, archaeologists, and linguists now integrate textual sources, material culture, and environmental data to reconstruct Saxon society with chronological precision and analytic rigor. Early medieval sources, such as Tacitus' Germania, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and Carolingian Annals, are examined critically, accounting for authorial bias, context, and purpose. Archaeological findings, including settlements, cemeteries, fortifications, and artifact assemblages, complement textual records, enabling scholars to identify patterns of migration, social organization, and cultural continuity. Historiographical developments have emphasized the fluidity and diversity of Saxon identity. Once treated as a monolithic people, the Saxons are now understood as a collection of interrelated tribes and communities whose self-perception evolved over time. Linguistic reconstruction of West Germanic dialects demonstrates the regional variation and gradual formation of Anglo-Saxon and Low Saxon linguistic traditions. These insights clarify that ethnonyms, such as Saxon, were frequently imposed by external observers before the emergence of a coherent collective identity. Archaeology has provided critical insights into daily life, political structures, and religious practices. Excavations of sunken-featured buildings, longhouses, and fortified sites reveal settlement organization, economic strategies, and defensive adaptations. Cemetery evidence, including cremation and inhumation practices, illuminates social hierarchy, kinship structures, and ritual behavior. Artifact assemblages, ranging from weaponry to jewelry and domestic tools, demonstrate both continuity with earlier Iron Age traditions and selective adoption of continental influences, highlighting the adaptive capacity of Saxon communities over centuries. Analysis of the Saxon Wars, Carolingian incorporation, and Anglo-Saxon kingdom formation has benefited from integrated archaeological and textual study. Frankish and English chronicles, when cross-referenced with settlement patterns and fortification evidence, reveal the interplay of military, political, and social factors in shaping Saxon trajectories. Scholars now recognize that Saxon resistance to Charlemagne and later responses to Viking and Norman pressures reflect both structural resilience and localized adaptation, rather than simplistic narratives of conquest or collapse. Linguistic studies further contextualize Saxon influence. Old English literature, charters, and inscriptions preserve grammatical, lexical, and semantic features rooted in Saxon speech, which continue to inform modern English. In northern Germany, Low Saxon dialects retain phonological and lexical traits that trace back to early Saxon settlement patterns. These linguistic continuities provide concrete evidence of cultural persistence, demonstrating that identity and communication networks extended beyond political or military dominance. Legal and social frameworks have similarly been reassessed. Codified laws such as the Lex Saxonum and Anglo-Saxon codes are analyzed for their reflection of kin-based governance, compensation practices, and territorial organization. Archaeological verification of estate boundaries, hall sites, and rural infrastructure confirms the operational application of these laws. Modern interpretation emphasizes the functional role of legal codes in maintaining social cohesion, regulating economic relationships, and integrating communities within larger political structures. Critical reevaluation of the Norman conquest and subsequent developments illustrates the resilience of Saxon identity under foreign rule. Textual and material evidence indicates that while political sovereignty was replaced, Saxon social structures, settlement patterns, and cultural practices persisted. This recognition challenges earlier historiographical assumptions that conquest equated to cultural erasure, highlighting the adaptive and integrative strategies employed by Saxon communities over successive periods of external pressure. Environmental and geographic studies have refined understanding of Saxon subsistence and settlement. Analysis of coastal marshlands, river systems, and soil productivity elucidates how the North Sea littoral and inland territories shaped agricultural, economic, and defensive practices. Archaeobotanical and zooarchaeological evidence demonstrates the centrality of mixed farming, seasonal mobility, and resource management. These findings confirm that environmental factors played a decisive role in both economic resilience and socio-political organization. Modern historiography also emphasizes transregional connections. Trade networks, raiding routes, and diplomatic interactions linked Saxons to neighboring Germanic groups, Frisia, Scandinavia, and the broader Carolingian world. Archaeological findings of imported goods, coins, and craftwork substantiate textual accounts of commerce and exchange, illustrating that Saxon communities were active participants in North Sea and continental networks. Such connectivity facilitated technological transfer, cultural exchange, and economic adaptation, reinforcing the sophistication of Saxon society. In contemporary scholarship, the Saxons are increasingly studied within comparative frameworks. Studies examine parallels with other Germanic groups, contrasting trajectories of settlement, political organization, and cultural adaptation. Linguistic, legal, and archaeological data are employed to trace both divergence and convergence across regions, situating the Saxons within broader European historical dynamics. This approach underscores the interplay of local tradition, external influence, and adaptive response in shaping long-term social and cultural outcomes. Reassessment of sources and evidence has also tempered earlier romanticized portrayals of the Saxons as purely heroic, warlike, or mythic. Modern interpretation prioritizes systemic analysis. How geography, kinship, economy, religion, and political structures interacted over time. By focusing on continuity, adaptation, and resilience, scholars provide a balanced understanding that emphasizes factual reconstruction over legend or nationalist narrative. Finally, modern archaeological and textual synthesis underscores the enduring relevance of Saxon studies. Legal, linguistic, and material legacies persist in shaping cultural and historical consciousness in England and northern Germany. Integration of multidisciplinary methods, including paleo-environmental analysis, settlement archaeology, and digital mapping, continues to refine chronological frameworks, elucidate social structures, and clarify long-standing debates regarding migration, conquest, and identity formation. By situating the Saxons within rigorous academic frameworks, modern scholarship illuminates the long-term contributions of their law, language, and social organization, bridging the gap between early medieval reality and the collective memory that shaped subsequent European development. Before you continue exploring the depth of history, subscribe to Nightfall History, click the bell icon for daily documentary updates, and share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Saxon history fascinated you most?